Hey everyone, welcome to our presentation today, Employee Engagement Survey Best Practices. My name is Charles Rogel. I work as the Chief Consulting Officer here at DecisionWise. I will be co-presenting with
Christian Nielsen. I'm part of our customer experience team, and I also have a consulting background, so excited to be here.
Christian's being humble. He has an extensive consulting background, greater than mine, and so he'll be adding in a lot of color commentary and insights to what we're presenting today. What we're doing is kind of a summary of our more extensive training that we do. We have an EX, or Employee Experience Certification training that we do, where we cover this particular topic amongst many others that deal with kind of how to set a listening strategy and really collect and utilize feedback from employees. And so we're going to go over more specifically about how to kind of conduct and run annual employee engagement survey, and what are some of the best practices there, which many, I think, of our clients that are on, as well as others. So I do want to welcome our clients. I see some of them in the chat listening in. Thanks for joining. And please use the chat as we go through this to add some of your own experiences. We'll kind of be polling you a bit. Ask questions. We'll try to answer those as we go and as we get through this. We've got a jam-packed session today with a lot of information that we'll share, and we're kind of excited to kind of get through this. We're not sure if we're going to get through it all. We kind of overloaded our presentation a bit here today, so we'll see how far we get and maybe skip around. This session is eligible for SHRM ongoing education credits, and so you get an email about that. You'll also get an email afterwards with a link to the recording and the presentation today. So here's our agenda. We're going to go through kind of the steps to run a survey, kind of the strategy behind it, as well as some of the action planning best practices on the backside here. And so we'll kind of be touching somewhat high level, dive into the weeds. We'll pause on questions and things like that. So let me just kind of jump in as we go here and talk about some of these things. We usually like to start off with this slide, just kind of set the stage on kind of trends that we're seeing in the workforce. Now, these are trends that we're hearing from our clients. So typically, as we conduct a survey with a client, employee engagement survey, we'll kind of listen to their needs, what they're hearing from their employees, what they're concerned about, those kind of things. Been tracking those year over year. We do a real formal rank ordering of what we think those top concerns are that we hear from our customers, and they've been shifting a bit. So when the pandemic set in 2020, you can see it was all about safety, DEI, communication, productivity, collaboration. And then it shifts into present day 2025, what we're kind of seeing and hearing in employee survey results, where compensation is kind of the number one topic. Now, it has improved. We're seeing improved perceptions there, but it still comes up like as the number one comment in the comments that we see on surveys, and doesn't score as high as well. Other topics, workload is still a concern, but not with all companies. Culture and diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, still a hot topic and something people are concerned about and want to measure. You'll notice at the bottom here, we've got kind of a continuum where at the beginning in 2020, the real strong focus was on DEI more specifically. And that's kind of shifted to be more of a holistic approach to look at our culture. Is it inclusive? Do we value diversity and inclusion and equity? And belonging. So it's kind of expanded a bit and been more of a focus on measuring culture. Then processes also get mentioned a lot and don't measure very well on employee surveys. People are kind of concerned with that efficiency that contributes to workload and retention. And then communication, we're seeing kind of lower perceptions on communication in some organizations. So I zipped through that a bit quickly. Christian, anything you want to add in terms of other things you're seeing or hearing on these topics?
No, it's fascinating to look through. I don't think I've been doing this work for a number of years, and I know you have as well. And we haven't seen 5 years like the last 5 years, 6 years like the last 6 years. It's been a fascinating time to try to keep up. We've had to change how we look at our benchmarks. We've had to change what to expect in employee surveys, but it's been a very fascinating 5-6 years.
Yeah, and I think another factor or workforce dynamic that's factoring in now is kind of remote work policies that's shifting back to being more office oriented, where we're seeing frustration from employees when that happens. Anytime we kind of disrupt the normal work life balance or whatever, we're going to see that kind of appear in the results. And yeah, compensation with inflation, things like that is still a concern. Org changes. Some organizations have experienced some layoffs that factors in. So all of these things kind of help contribute a bit to some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of these themes or topics overall. Okay, so we'll kind of touch on this a bit more as we go in terms of trying to understand this. But Christian, I wanted to have you kind of talk to this slide a bit about how we look at these different concepts overall.
Yeah, love to. This is one of my favorite conversations. It's interesting. A lot of times we'll have folks come to us for an engagement survey or some other kind of survey, and it's because leadership told them, "Hey, HR, run a culture survey." Well, what do we mean by culture, and what are we trying to measure? We can speak a little bit about that, but it's helpful to have a nice definition for each of these terms and understanding how they work together. So the first thing, let's talk culture. And for each, we have kind of a formal and an informal definition here. A set of beliefs, norms, a set of values, norms, guiding beliefs, and understandings that is shared by members of an organization, taught to new members as a way to feel, think, and behave. I love that line around it's taught to new members. I remember when I worked in healthcare, I worked in organizational effectiveness in healthcare, and it was a little more of a formal setting, as you typically see within healthcare. But I noticed nobody told me how to dress, and I dressed appropriate, except for I noticed all my colleagues wore ties. Guess what I did the next day? I wore a tie. It's a cultural norm. It's taught informally, formally to people around us. Culture it goes beyond ties, and in fact, it's everything that interlocks to form the way we work around here. But that's that casual definition we've got there, the way we do things around here. That's culture. If we look at employee experience, what is employee experience? Well, it's the sum of perceptions employees have about their interactions with the organization in which they work. It's the impact of the culture. We have a culture. We've created a world. Now we've added people to it, and they're going to experience that. And then the third topic we usually add on this slide is employee engagement. Well, engagement is the result. It's an emotional state where we feel passionate, energetic, and committed toward our work. In turn, we fully invest our best selves in the work we do. I like to say it's how much of my best self do I feel like bringing to this role or to this workplace experience. So we have a culture which creates an employee experience, which is what I call the invitation, where people get to choose how much they engage with that. And so the emotional response to the employee experience. So these terms are important. We'll look at them a few different ways as we go through this.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, and just to expound on kind of how we define engagement, we look at it in two parts. First, we say it's kind of this emotional state, like you can see here. So how are you feeling about your job? Are you passionate, committed towards your work? And if you are, it results in some action. And so this is where people that are more engaged tend to want to contribute more, do more, invest more. They care more about the work and the outcomes and how we're doing. So we say we invest our hearts, spirits, minds, and hands into the work that we do. So that's our definition of engagement and what we're trying to measure on these employee surveys. We also have a model and methodology. And so as we've been doing this for like the past 29 years, we see these kind of concepts emerge in the survey questions that we're asking. Several of the statements deal with this foundational level of satisfaction, where we're measuring things like pay, benefits, training, remote work opportunities, resources, things like that. If these things are working for you, typically you will stay longer at an organization. So they're not necessarily motivating, but they generally impact your work experience or attitude, so to speak. So we generally say satisfaction is very important, forms the foundation upon which engagement can grow, and it also helps to drive retention. People will stick around longer if these things are working for them. If they're not, though, they can be a detractor to engagement. So if you modify your remote work policy, people aren't happy. If people feel like there's some safety issues, those things can detract from people's ability to engage. Engagement, like we just talked about, drives performance, and usually the typical drivers of engagement are these magic elements. So as we conduct a multiple regression analysis on survey data using our engagement questions or anchor questions to measure engagement, we find these other topics emerge as drivers of engagement. So if you experience more meaning in your work, or growth opportunities, or you have an impact in the work that you're doing, you will tend to be more engaged in your work. These are the motivating things that we're trying to cultivate, the good experiences that drive engagement. So from here, what we want to talk about then is kind of this listening strategy. So we're talking about engagement, how we're measuring that, but how do we measure, as Christian described, that overall employee experience, with engagement kind of being a component of that. So again, oops, I went the wrong way. Kind of have 3 tips here. We believe, and we would promote, that every organization should have a strategy for how it listens to employees, whether it be formal using surveys or informal doing focus groups or listening sessions. We would say doing a once-a-year engagement survey is not really enough. So it's a nice cadence. It gives us a nice lump sum of data, but there's more you can do, which we'll show you here in a moment. And then if you are going to ask, make sure you follow up and act on the feedback. It frustrates employees if they feel like they're taking these surveys and they don't see anything happening.
Right. And just a couple other points on this. We've seen a lot of different flavors on engagement trends around how often we're listening. Do we do these little tiny surveys? Ultimately, we keep coming back. The evidence supports an annual survey with enough items to measure the employee experience. And I know we'll get into how long those surveys are in a bit, but it's just interesting. We see that the wheel keep coming back to an annual anchor survey, so that we have essentially this broader view of the employee experience, and also a starting line for action. And also the organizations that don't do it every year, we have to rebuild trust every year. What is this? Is this a safe experience? Is this something that my boss is going to see what I put? We have to go through that whole exercise again. And so the organizations that really win with this are the ones that are consistently running their surveys annually, and just it's a cultural expectation.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You see these other ones kind of peppered in here that are what we might call a life cycle survey. They happen during certain events and employees experience with an organization. But also, you pepper this in with more assessments for your leaders, either 360 assessments and others. But the intent is really to glean insights. And what we find is when you get these insights in front of leaders, they tend to want, it prompts them to act. So it's a catalyst for change. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to measure, see how we're doing, see what perceptions are, and get that data in the hands of managers so that they'll want to do something different, create a better experience, because we know it drives better retention in organizations and better performance overall. All right, so I think we're probably preaching to the choir a bit on some of these things, but we want to kind of set some expectations around this. So I was going to ask you again, Christian, to do kind of an AI summary of this slide, unless you want to read every bullet point, and kind of talk about this model a bit.
Yeah, we'll give you Christian intelligence, and you can run it through AI later to correct everything. But so years of doing this work, we've identified not every organization, or even every part of every organization, if you think through larger companies and conglomerates and things like that, are at the same level of readiness for engagement. Meaning, we may have never run an engagement survey. This is our first time doing it. That's different than, hey, we've been doing this every year for 20 years. It's part of who we are and how we operate. And so we built a maturity model. This is one version of it that helps us understand. We identified 5 layers, and actually there's a 6th that would be below measurement, which would be passive. We're not doing anything. Engagement might be high or low, but we're not actively managing it. Obviously, when we start working with an organization, they're no longer passively measuring or passively letting it happen. We've moved into a measurement level. Measurement level is we're ready to measure engagement, communicate results, and do something. And as we move up, there's additional tasks and opportunities as we continue to move up. Commitment level, executives buy in. Management level, we get individual managers and teams bought in that they have a role to play in shaping the employee experience of the organization. So what's interesting about this model is not only the detail and what we're actually considering in action plans at each level, but the sense of ownership is really interesting, because at a measurement level, it's perceived as, oh, this is HR's project and also HR's problem. It's HR's job to improve engagement. And very limited things are possible if we stay at this measurement level. It's good to step in if we've never run a survey. We have to start somewhere, but we don't want to stay at measurement. We don't want this to be seen as only HR's initiative. That's why as we move up, we expand that to senior leadership buying in and recognizing and endorsing this, and also taking meaningful action. As we move up, we're expanding that to individual managers. Ultimately, we're trying to get to a place where everyone understands that we all play a role in co-creating what it feels like to work at this organization. We may have different influence levels based on our position or relationships, but this model is helpful to us understanding, okay, where are we this year? What are we ready to take on? How does action planning tie into what we've done last year and where we want to be next year? It's just another framework we've used to help our client.
Yeah, and I like that part on the far right where we move from reacting to results to being more proactive. We're like using the results to inform how we're implementing initiatives to drive a good experience in the organization.
Yep.
Yeah, and so again, you'll get access to these slides, or do a screenshot, whatever you want on this one. But it's a helpful conversation to have with executives to kind of plot your strategy and also understand their appetite for change and involvement here. Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts more. So now we're going to talk about kind of best practices if you're going to run this annual survey. And so on the left side, we kind of got the description. So, about 50 questions. We get a big lump sum or big pile of data to work with that measures several different concepts. We're looking at your hierarchy and your employee demographics so we can get data into managers' hands. So any team that gets like 5 or more responses can get a report. We do a lot of analysis, driver analysis, executive debrief, reports for managers. And usually there's kind of 2 components. There's like an organization action planning phase as well as a team action planning phase. And Christian, do you want to cover the stuff on the right?
Sure. So, if it's our first time running through it, a lot of times the goal of this is let's get a baseline. This is also great if you have a change in leadership. I've done a number of these recently where, hey, we have a new CEO coming in. We want to get a read of the landscape so that we've got kind of a starting line of when this new leader's tenure began. But it's also, we've never done it. We want to get that baseline. Measures, factors that drive performance. We want to improve the employee experience because the employee experience helps the individual, helps the organization. And there's variables in here that we want to improve to help manage individual and organizational performance. Identify organization themes and opportunities. So we're trying to understand, okay, what are our strengths? And also, where do we have room to adjust? And in those early levels of the maturity model, we're usually doing that at a high level. What are 2 or 3 themes that apply to all of us versus getting more granular with manager action planning and things like that? As we move forward, it's just as Charles said, empowering managers with information. Here's the experience your team's having. Here's the data. You can be more strategic now that you've got this information. Promote organizational change. I love to customize a survey. If you've got large change initiatives, let's say you're implementing an ERP, and a moment of peace and empathy for those that are in the midst of large technology implementations, which nowadays seems to be everybody. But you can check in on those initiatives as well. Create alignment on organizational behavior, and also on that promoting change. It's accountability from the prior survey. Did we move the needle? Did we take enough action in enough meaningful areas to improve the overall experience? And then creating alignment on organizational behaviors. Are we building an experience that's aligned with what we need as an organization? Are we going to be able to accomplish our operational goals and our strategy? Do we have the people element aligned to that? So a lot of things, in Charles, I keep looking at that 50 over there. To some people's ears, that sounds like a lot. Some people's ears, it sounds like not very much. How long does it take for an employee on average to answer 50 questions?
Yeah, it's only like 8 to 10 minutes. So here's kind of, so good segue. And so it does seem overwhelming. And some people look at 50 questions and they go, oh man. I look at this and say, if you're getting over 65 questions, you almost have too much to work with. Like when we try to do the analysis on the back end, man, there are just so many topics and themes that you're measuring here. It's hard to kind of draw focus to the element that's most important. And so generally, around 50 questions is a good number. And we'll get into the details here more, but we'll ask about questions about the job, team, supervisor. We usually just have 2 open-ended comment questions at the end. Those are the ones that take a long time to complete. So imagine, you're answering that, you're typing in a few sentences, that takes a couple minutes. And so we limit those to kind of a catch-all type statements around what do you like about working here? What could we do better? And Christian, you touched on this, customized versus standard items. We've got some standard items. We can give you some good benchmark comparisons. But if you customize, now you're asking questions about the initiatives and topics that are important for your people that drive performance. And so really you want to not be beholden to benchmarks as much, so that you can focus on those good topics. And yeah, go ahead.
Just that, I mean, across a lot of these, it's a game of trade-offs, right? What are we giving up? What are we getting? And just being very thoughtful in the survey design and structure conversations. I think it's talking to, hopefully working with an expert that can help explain, this is what we recommend, this is what we see most often, here's what you're getting, here's what you're giving up as you make these different decisions.
Yeah. And then just to touch on benchmarks, because that comes up and that's a big concern for people, because I want to see, okay, is this a good score or a bad score? Is this high or low compared to what you typically see? And so there's various ways to kind of structure and look at benchmarks. A lot of times we like to use what we call our global 4-year rolling benchmark, because it's very stable. In other words, these items that get measured year over year don't tend to change very much between organizations or overall. So it gives you a nice pinpoint to kind of say, okay, this is a average score, and then we can tell what's high or low compared to that. But we can also look at data for last year by company size, various industries, and so on. Where you get into trouble if you're trying to benchmark is everyone wants to say, hey, can you compare us to our 5 main competitors? And it's virtually impossible because, number one, a couple of them probably aren't doing a survey, and not every competitor that you have is probably working with us or the company you're working with to do a survey. So you don't have kind of those same items. And plus, they might not be asking the same questions either. So it kind of gets a little dicey the more specific you want to get with your benchmarks for several reasons. But they are valuable. We like them. We use them. They inform how we want to kind of react to the data. So then we talk about kind of how to break up your survey and think about how you want to structure it and what you want to use. A couple things here. We have, various types of indices you can use. We call it an index. And, we have engagement, intent to stay. You can create a DEI or leadership. Most times we just do an engagement index because we're using a subset of questions to measure engagement specifically. And then you can kind of create these groups. You can say, well, this one's fully engaged. These are disengaged. How do they respond to the survey questions differently? By creating profiles, now you can say the least engaged people, well, they're having trouble with this. They're scoring low on these questions here. So that tells us they're less engaged because of workload and stress and lack of growth opportunities, for example. So that gives you some good insight in terms of how to respond to the data by using an index.
Yeah. Charles, maybe, I don't know if this is a good time for the question, but I love this question. We run engagement surveys.
Oh, yeah.
No, in our chat, there we go. We run engagement surveys quarterly. Do you believe that's a lot and should be run only annually or semi-annually? This is a really great chance for me to use my favorite consulting response, which is it depends.
Right.
There's a number of factors. I have some organizations where that quarterly works really well. It depends on size. It depends on there's some cultural aspects. And one indication that I pay very close attention to see if it's the right model is going to be if we see participation drop, or if we have open-ended comments and we're getting less depth and meaningful, actionable content out of that, you're probably overdoing it. I prefer a model where you still run a robust engagement survey that's kind of that bigger bang, 50 items, and then run smaller pulses quarterly if those other metrics line up. But
less questions, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to, are you actioning on it? So if people feel like, hey, this data is informing decisions around here and we're seeing outcomes, some change, then yeah, keep doing it, because that's driving good experiences for folks. But if they feel like, hey, I keep answering this and nothing's happening, you'll burn them out and you'll lose that confidence.
Another kind of interesting model, and we could overwhelm everybody with options on this, but another one is to run an annual survey, but have more frequent ENPS measures, whether that's through anniversary surveys or pulse things. That ENPS is Employee Net Promoter Score. Basically, I would recommend this organization is a great place to work. Doesn't give a lot of actionable data by itself, but it is a really nice health monitoring metric where you can say, executives give that quarterly update, or even monthly if we're doing it through anniversary surveys. So there's interesting ways to still use that annual, but to subsidize it with some other metrics. And then of course you showed all the life cycle and other things that are part of a robust program.
Yeah. I'm going to get to Mo's question here on our next slide about trust, but first I want to talk a bit about dimensions. So another way to group this is like questions about the job itself, tools and resources, for example. You can include several questions about their supervisor, their local supervisor experience, like how are they interacting? And that's really good because, again, we're reinforcing the good behaviors we want our managers to have as they interact with their teams. And it's very obvious when you run the survey where some of those behaviors are lacking in your organization with individuals. The team experience is usually pretty good. We have a few questions there just to say, hey, are we getting along as a team? Those usually score pretty high. And then the bulk of the questions are really in the organization section about communication, collaboration. Some of those DEI culture questions are in there too. And that's where we're measuring kind of the organization perceptions. The trust one I'd put kind of as a separate survey theme. So some of the trust is, do I trust my manager? There's a question like that. Do I trust my teammates? Do I trust senior leaders or the organization? So trust is kind of a multifaceted topic that you can measure in different ways. And there are some questions there that you can use to kind of get at that concept. Trust is usually an outcome. We call it kind of one of those outcome statements, because if you say, hey, this organization trusts me to do my job, is one question, as opposed to I trust senior leaders to lead us in the right direction. And so there's various things that you're trying to get at. And then you're trying to uncover, okay, well, is trust or lack of trust in senior leadership, is that due to lack of communication and transparency or accountability? And so that's when you start peeling the onion a bit and trying to understand. A lot of times that emerges in the comments where people will say, well, I don't trust senior leaders for this reason. So that's a good way to do it as well. But yeah, so, you break it down even further, you get these themes or topics that you're trying to action on or work on. And these are some examples of some of those comments too.
Yeah. Really great. Just a couple other quick questions or comments here. Who can initiate engagement survey in an organization? HR, top leadership? Again, it depends. Usually HR is the one that's reaching out to us, but a lot of times it's an executive. Either they've done the work to get executive support, or an executive said, hey, we need to run a survey. I've got questions and we need some data on the experience we're creating. So it comes from either direction, but oftentimes it's HR that's at least reaching out to us to get the process started. Yeah, and I like Wayne's comment. Yeah. Wayne's comment is very, very astute, and it goes back to that maturity model. Who owns engagement? Who's perceived as owning engagement? If it's only HR's baby, yes, that's maybe necessary to get things moving, but we don't want that, years to go by and say, hey, how come nothing changed? Why didn't HR do anything? Well, so much happens at the senior leadership level. So much happens within the manager team relationship. So, and HR can only influence. HR can do a lot, but they can't do it all.
Yeah, those are good points. One thing we didn't touch on, I think, is important, is that sometimes, these surveys, these big annual surveys, are viewed a little bit more risky by HR because there's kind of like we're asking everyone to participate. We're giving managers reports. We're expecting them to do some. So it's a big ask that we have of the organization to do the annual survey. So it tends to be, looked on, observed more by more people. There's a bit more risk involved. So you want to make sure you execute it properly and get some good outcomes. But if you have senior leadership support, that's going to be very important. And for example, if your CEO is very interested in the perceptions of people, cares about that stuff, you will have more success. If it's more, hey, HR, this is best practice, CEO, we need to do this, and they agree to it, a lot of times they react positively to the data. You give the data to the senior leadership team, and they're going to say, oh gosh, we got some work to do. But yeah, getting their buy-in is always a ongoing struggle, or a struggle sometimes.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to shift gears. You know, we talked about design a bit. Again, we talked about customized questions, benchmarking, that sort of thing, the number of questions. But again, you're trying to ask the questions that'll give you good data to act on later on. And so to get good participation, here's kind of, you know, basically the survey process overview. This is what our project managers normally take clients through. And essentially, you know, there's some prep time. We're going to design a survey, talk about questions. You got to get your employee data exported from your HRIS and kind of develop a hierarchy. Who's going to get reports? How does that work? Sometimes your HRIS is not up to date. And so some of that work needs to be done, because when people get reports on the back end, they're going to say, hey, I got 6 people here, but only 5 people in my group. What's going on? So you have to make sure that's accurate. Admin, we normally say leave it open for 2 weeks. You get good participation. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then as you roll it out, it takes a few weeks to kind of compile the reports and get those meetings scheduled so you can meet with your executives and managers and so on down the line. So more to come here. You know, hierarchy and demographics, there's several things you can do with this that gives you some good insight, because you're really trying to understand what are the key populations in our organization. What are we trying to measure? You know, job role, department, manager status, you know, things like that are very important to understand differences in perception by these groups. And so there's several things you can use on the survey. A lot of this is just provided in the employee file and measured on the back end, because we can use some unique survey links. So everyone's taking the survey and we can tie all this stuff on the back end, so you don't need to ask these questions on the survey.
And that ties in a bit to our question here around how do we manage data protection, confidentiality, but also accuracy. So, you know, to Charles' point, we for I think 95% of the people or organizations we work with, we capture all this with the employee list on the back end. That way it's completely accurate. If we ask people to self-identify, put their own information in there, then they will misrepresent a lot of times. We'll get that data will be wrong. And so it does a couple things. One, it's 100% clean, accurate data behind the scenes. And then 2, it shortens the survey taking experience for people. They don't have to go in and fill out all their details. And then in terms of confidentiality, we have different thresholds in place that we won't let you cut or slice the data below certain response levels. So we take confidentiality very, very seriously, and we want to make sure that this is a safe experience for those involved in the survey.
Yeah, normally that threshold is 5 responses. We need 5 or more responses in any of these groups to show any data to maintain that anonymity.
Yep.
You know, and so just so you understand, and this isn't, you know, this is probably pretty normal, but this is very important. So, you know, as you get the list and organize it, and you're trying to say who gets reports and reports to who, you know, this will help you kind of organize this so that you can disperse manager reports throughout the organization for action planning at the local level. So the hierarchy, it takes some work. That's why we say, you know, budget about 6 weeks beforehand to kind of get this set up and organized. Methodology, you know, most people have email nowadays. So most organizations, if it's office, you know, an office environment, that's the best way to do it. A unique link gets sent out. So everyone, you know, has their own survey. That's how we tie it all to the demographics on the back end. But we also do a lot of kiosk, paper, and mobile surveys for those like in a restaurant environment or manufacturing environment. So collecting that, it is harder, but it's worth it. And that's why we say when you do an annual survey, you know, if you're going to put that much effort in to do a kiosk, paper survey, pull people off the line essentially to take a survey, that's where it's nice to have a large set of questions that you're using to get some good data there.
Yeah. Kiosk, just a little bit, it's that shared computer. Yeah, as you mentioned, we do see that in less paper, thank goodness. Paper's, there's logistically a lot to handle. We still have a number of clients that use paper, but 10 years ago, we saw a lot more of that.
Yeah. Let's see, a couple questions I'm just tracking here. You know, heat map, we'll talk about heat map Mo mentioned, can you see a heat map by department facility? And yeah, you can in our system, and we do recommend that. Like, you want to look at these demographics and see where there's highs and lows by all these differences. And two surveys to run for like senior and middle management, the one for the rest of the organization. We generally say ask all the same questions to everyone in the organization, break it all out by demographics later on, because it's much easier to analyze. If you try to do 2 surveys and then look at it separately, it's a little bit more of a headache. And so generally ask the same questions and see how they differ in responses. We'll show an example here in a moment.
And that's much cleaner for roll-up data, because usually with the senior leaders, they want to see their entire span, and it's helpful to have the same instrument across all populations. We can do things like masking if you've got certain populations that, hey, we mostly want to use the same survey, but for example, in healthcare settings, I've seen it where our clinical leaders get, or clinical staff get a few different questions that the rest of the population doesn't. But in general, same survey. That would change if we're talking 360 feedback, different competencies for senior leaders versus middle management and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Robert asked a good question about when to take the survey. They got some seasonal workers that sometimes experience layoffs at the time that the survey is normally conducted. There's generally no great time. A lot of our clients will do a survey either in the spring or the fall. They avoid the summer or end of year. And, generally if there are layoffs, we'd say, hey, run the survey anyway, because you want to kind of listen to people and get their feedback and let them vent a bit, because there will be some disruption in what they experience. And so don't be afraid of getting lower scores this time because of a organization change. In this case, yeah, you can segment out those craft workers a bit to kind of see, okay, how are their perceptions differing compared to the rest of the organization, because that group experiences different layoffs. So it is hard to kind of choose and pick. You're trying to satisfy a lot of managers' needs in terms of, when there's enough time to do it. And there will be some populations that probably isn't the best time overall.
That might be a good situation to also do an off-cycle pulse, mid-year through when you're not in that situation, just to see if it differs dramatically.
And then also to Don's question about a move towards kiosks, that's an interesting concept there because of security concerns. We haven't experienced that yet. We do, there is an exercise of kind of safe listing the links that come through the organization so people know, but because we have been hammering people not to click on any foreign links, it does take some effort to convince them otherwise that, hey, this survey link is legit. You can use this one. So you have to do a lot more communication around that stuff.
Yeah.
All right. So we mentioned this earlier, it's all online, no visible demographic data because you're capturing that in the background. And then we had those confidentiality thresholds of 5 or more that keep it confidential. The point we're trying to make here is you're trying to make it a safe experience. People want to know that their data is not going to be compromised. They won't see any individual responses. It might take a year or 2 to build that confidence, because after you do it the first time and people realize, oh, nobody got fired. Okay, maybe I'll be more honest next time. You build that trust over time.
Yeah.
And then you can track participation. This is where, again, participation is important because you're trying to get these small groups that have less employees to take it so that that manager can get a report. What usually happens the first year you do it, they're not as serious about participation. Maybe you get 75% of people to take it. And then what happens is those managers don't get a report. And they're like, I got 10 people in my group. How come I can't get a report? Well, only 3 of them took the survey. Oh, shoot. Okay, now I understand. And so now they feel left out. And so the second year, we generally see a little bit more effort to people getting people in on taking the survey. Any recommendations, Christian, that you have on best practices to boost participation?
I used to call it the power of positive pizza. Where we give you participation numbers, you can do some internal contests and fun things there. I do worry you can overdo this. If you walk around and are very hard-handed on this, then it can, especially if it's a new process, it can feel like Big Brother, and it can create some suspicious folks. So that you can overdo it, but keeping it light, sending some internal communications and along with our project plan communications that just goes to those that haven't taken it, goes a long ways. And doing fun things like, hey, the first team to get, or the team in this department that gets the highest participation gets X, Y, or Z. Those type of things work very well. And it's one of the first numbers we celebrate every time we debrief. We want to thank people. Thanks for engaging in this and giving us some of your input. It's interesting to wax a little longer. It's interesting. We have items that measure employee voice, and those correlate heavily with feeling cared for by the organization. I feel cared for when I feel heard and when I feel seen. And this survey is not the only piece of that puzzle, but it can be a very important piece to help connect the dots. We're listening, you've been heard, we're responding.
Yeah, and 82% is our average. We generally see that pretty easily in office environments where everyone's got an email address. A little bit lower maybe in manufacturing or people that are out in the field. But the question that always comes up is like, well, what about the 20% of people that didn't take the survey? Are they the angry ones? And it's not. So we have a really robust data set here. If everyone else took the survey, we wouldn't see the results change. The margin of error is very, very low. All right, so I want to get into the fun stuff here, reporting and analytics. So now you've collected your data, survey closed. Now we're ready to kind of look at it and analyze it. And I kind of have some best practices here in terms of what to look for. Like, how do I approach the data? What am I trying to understand? Well, you get an overall score, you get an engagement score. Did it go up? Did it go down overall? How do we compare to the benchmarks? Overall, are we above the benchmarks or below benchmarks? So are these good or bad scores? And then you look at the questions themselves, like which one scored highest, which one scored lowest? Do those tell us any themes? In other words, high scores are generally around the team questions we ask. So people are having a good experience at the team level. Low scores are around communication, collaboration, and workload, for example. So you can see that. And you're also tracking, did we improve in some of those areas or go down? What are the benchmark comparisons to tell us how good of a score that is? And the third item here, who are the key populations? Like, are we concerned about the folks that work out in the field more? Are we concerned about people in the marketing department because we made a lot of changes there? Like, what are the populations that really generate us a bunch of revenue, and how happy are they in the organization overall? And then the comment insights really provide the color commentary to the results and help confirm what we're seeing. Oh, so lower questions or lower agreement on questions related to processes in the organization. And then a lot of the comments were about processes in the organization. What do they say? And so you can dive into those too. Yep. So I wanted to pivot and just kind of give you an example of how we might look at this. And so I've got some online data for a sample company pulled up in this online reporting tool. And here we can kind of see the overall score for all 50 or so questions on the survey is 78%, 2 points higher than what we measured the year before. Pretty good participation for this group overall. And then you can kind of see some of these higher and lower scoring questions, the 10 highest, 10 lowest, and did they move? So this one about understanding how my work contributes to overall success of the organization, that went up by 12 points, which is really significant. And then another one over here, let's see anyone decrease a bit. Well, a couple decreased a little. This one, my supervisor cares about me, went down 3 points. Here's another one, expectations with my supervisor. So a few of the supervisor statements decreased somewhat over time, even though they're pretty high. So it gives you a feel for, okay, what we're seeing overall in the data. Usually you'll want to kind of dive in, do some of these sorts that we talked about before. So first thing I do, I'm in here, okay, let's look at these data points. What are the high scoring questions in this organization? We saw that kind of on the first page. What are the low scoring questions? We're looking kind of at the percent of agreement. So you can say typically industry-wide, you look at the 5-point scale and you break it into the favorable responses, which are agree, the neutral, and the unfavorable. And then you can see the differences overall. So, hey, working across departments and functions, it improved a bit, 6 points higher than we measured before. So it gives you a feel that, okay, lower scoring questions, we're seeing some good movement in some of these areas. And then high scoring questions, you can also see how those played out a bit. There's some of those supervisor statements that went down a bit. The good thing you can do here too is you can look at some of the demographic comparisons. So this is where I was talking about populations. And in terms of working effectively across departments and functions, this is where you can now say, okay, how's it doing across, tenure groups or more importantly, it'd be like departments or work location, for example, where you can see, okay, it's in office employees who have lower perceptions on that statement than others. So this helps you kind of triangulate a bit where the opportunities are and what you want to focus on as well. The demographics, again, we asked several demographics on the survey. One thing we're seeing here is that manager perceptions are slightly lower than non-managers. And so, again, that tells us, oh, what's going on there? We want to make sure our managers are feeling pretty good. And generally, manager perceptions are higher than non-managers. And so you want to be able to just kind of slice or sort some of this data so you can look at some of the differences in perceptions here, somewhat in a heat map type exercise. The way we do it is we just kind of look at both of the populations side by side and say, what are the biggest differences between these groups? And you'll see manager perceptions are lower on this statement related to stress and workload. So, okay, managers are pretty busy. That's why we're seeing lower perceptions overall compared to non-managers. What can we do to better support them in their job? So those are some of the kind of insights you're looking for here. We talked about comparisons before. This is kind of how you look at, what I would look at in terms of, several benchmarks here. But I just want to look at kind of the global benchmark and the change. And, again, if I look at our high scoring questions, those are pretty comparable to what we see in the global benchmark, those percentages of agreement. And, some of these went up. This one here, question 35, went up in terms of how my work contributes. But this other one went down, my supervisor treating with respect, even though it's still right above that global benchmark overall. So tells you if your high scores or low scores are good or bad, moving in the right direction, and gives you some perspective to see how important is this topic for us to work on overall. The last thing I want to just touch on here is, and help me out with the questions too. They're zipping in here, Christian. I'm not looking at them that closely, so interrupt me as we go.
I'm trying to type a few responses, and we'll address a few as we go as well.
Great. Okay. The other thing is, those open-ended questions. So we typically say, ask a couple that are kind of broad, what's working, what's not working essentially in the organization. And then you have the ability, typically what you want to do, either you can do this manually and read through these and categorize these by topics or theme. Here we can see that of all the questions that came in, 18% of them had something to do with internal processes in the organization. So the system uses machine learning to essentially go through and categorize these by topic or theme. So it gives you a feel for what's being talked about more in the comments themselves. You can export them, read them all, whatever you want. You'll notice that there's like 370 comments here. What you also can do now is either, in our platform, we've got it integrated, but you can also use AI to just export all your comments and summarize them. And so here you can see that, you get nice bullet points for each of these different topics that are mentioned in the comments. You can see leadership management, company culture, well-being. Here's that processes and systems things that people were talking a lot about. So what are they saying about processes? Okay, it's about tools, it's about performance evaluation, feedback systems, things like that. So it gives you kind of a real quick summary of what people are saying on these things. And then, of course, you'll see some things about compensation, benefits, and other areas here. So this is a nice way to quickly summarize your stuff. Again, you can use any AI tool essentially to summarize comments nowadays. It's really effective. Here we've just got it embedded in the tool, and you can do it quickly for any population that you have in your group. I like the ability to do AI summary now when we're analyzing results, because again, we can really hone in. Okay, we're concerned about processes. What do we need to do? Well, we get some suggestions here pretty quickly on topics that are important to the workforce. All right, Christian, I zipped through that pretty quick just to kind of give an example of how you might approach and analyze results. Anything you want to add?
No, I was responding to questions. I was typing. Charles,
oh, thank you.
I can't think and type. No, this tool is purpose built, and this is a good example. One of the questions that I was responding to is, what's the difference between us and Qualtrics?
Oh, yeah.
And I mentioned Qualtrics is a very robust tool. It does a lot with research, CX, some EX, and we only focus on EX. So we like to say we've gone deeper in this space, and all of our products and services are around employee experience, employee engagement, 360 feedback, those types of things. while Qualtrics has a different model. I would also point out we have some differences in marketing budget as well.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a complete platform, and again, I think you get. We also provide a lot of assistance and analytics and kind of consulting on the back end here as well in terms of the results. And so if you're looking for more of the support nature, I'm being too salesy here, but if you're looking for that type of service, that's what we do here. We're just trying to show mainly best practices and approaches to how you would analyze your results in any online platform.
And we're smiling. We've done work with them throughout the years. Their headquarters is about 5 miles away from where we're sitting here.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with it. Yeah, in fact, I've done several surveys on the Qualtrics platform, and it has very comparable ways of analyzing the data as well that give you some good insights. One additional piece that we really focus on is getting managers' data. So you can have managers log into the system and look at data like we're seeing here. But another benefit is really getting reports into the hands of managers that's easy to work with, because many don't want to log in, learn how to navigate and that sort of thing. So if you can export a report for your managers that summarizes the data and kind of pulls out the insights that they need to focus on, that's going to help them facilitate action planning within their teams. And so that's another piece. That's a lot of work too, to kind of generate some of those reports. But that's very beneficial and really helps them to take action. So that's another kind of output you want to look for. Not only does HR kind of get in there and do all the analytics and have fun with the online, reporting tool, but how are we going to package this for our managers? What do we need them to know and work on as you go forward? So, okay, so I touched on reporting. Once you have those results, the other thing I was going to say is part of the exercise is when you're analyzing the results and exporting, you basically are creating kind of a slide deck that you're going to present to your executive team. And it'll have several components in it, like, the engagement indices and maybe an intent to stay indice. We're looking at high and low scores. So there's several different ways to kind of present the summary results to the executive team. But what you're trying to get them to is to identify the organization topics or themes. So this is what we're good at as an organization. And here are the opportunities I think we need to focus on as a leadership group. Once you have that kind of agreed upon, then you can kind of communicate that to your leaders in the organization. Like we saw, managers are overworked. Stress and workload is an important topic for managers. Well, we're going to provide more support and resources, and maybe well, no one ever does this, but maybe ask for less, emphasize less change this year, so there's things you can do to support that and address that with your people. We're trying to get executives get their heads around the data and also inspire them to take some action on some of these topics. Of course, they're probably going to hand this off to the HR team to help manage and shepherd throughout the year, but we want to make sure there's an emphasis going forward. That'll then distill a bit so managers know what we're focusing on. They'll know what to look at in their results too. Is it around collaboration or workload? And that helps facilitate action planning. Here we've got just a general rollout action planning template that we encourage people, steal this and modify it, like make it unique to your organization. The general rollout looks like this, where there's an initial executive debrief, right? They're the first ones to see the results after HR has gone through and really combed through the data. Then they get reports for their department. They also get reports for every manager that rolls up to them if they want them, so they can sit down and do one-on-ones. Typically, there's kind of a debrief with all your managers, and maybe it's the same slide deck you presented to your executive team with less breakouts, for example. And then you give them their reports, and you kind of say, hey, here's what's in your report. Here's what you want to do, how to analyze the data, that kind of stuff. And then you either send out an email to all your employees and thank them for their feedback and share some of the results, or you share, the report, whatever you want to do there. But the real action planning happens later with the managers. And so generally we say, department heads, sit down with your managers one-on-one, look at their reports together, strategize a bit on what they should do, and then get them having manager-led team discussions with their people on the results and come up with some action plans. You might say, hey, we're only going to focus on those with, the bottom 20% in the organization. And we're going to have our HR BPs help support that process and roll it out. But this is kind of how you would disseminate and cascade the results in the organization. I feel like I've been doing too much talking here. Anything else, Christian, that you want to add in here? Looks like you're answering all the comments there too.
No, this is where that maturity model really comes into play. What are we ready to do? And there's a few ways that people get it wrong. They try to do too much and they end up doing nothing, or they don't do anything and they do nothing, or they do amazing things and they don't communicate it. I like to say you don't have to do everything. You just have to do a few of the right things, and you have to, if you do this much, communicate it this much. I'm going off screen. Communicate. We like to say get credit for the homework.
Yeah.
We often see organizations do, and leaders that sincerely and deeply care about their employees do amazing things, but they don't communicate and don't share or connect it back. And employees have an amazing ability to disconnect the result from the fact that they were asked for this in the survey. So those are just some things I see where organizations miss the mark on these.
A really good point. Yeah, it's like do something and make sure you get credit for it. Typically, we say there's kind of two tiers to this action planning approach, and so this is kind of a real blown out model with a lot of steps to it. And again, you'll get access to this here. I just want to briefly say, at the organization level, we might put together a committee to work on some of these things and to kind of expand on what are the action items. The team level action planning happens, coincides with that as well. And so we're asking our managers to sit down with their teams and come up with some simpler plans within each of their groups. An example here is we like to use kind of this typical model of, defining the current state, the future state, and then backfilling your action plans here. So what will typically occur is that we identify communication as an opportunity in the organization. So maybe you do a focus group or two, or you have this committee get together to talk about what's not working with communication. You get a bunch of stuff written out on flip charts or whiteboards around the room. You collect it all. You recognize the things that are kind of outside your control. So let's scratch off a list of things that aren't feasible that we can really action on. But let's summarize all the other stuff that we think is important. So you kind of get a big brainstormy long list, and you summarize that into nice 5 or 3 topics here about what's going on with communication in the current state. So people, we don't know what people want to hear about in terms of communication. It's not timely and frequent. It's noisy or unprioritized. We're not sure what's important. And maybe we don't understand the why behind some of this stuff. So in the future, we'll know all that. And that helps us then to go back and action plan and backfill these actions. Now, if you don't do this, what happens is everyone starts blurting out action items we should focus on without really describing what the topic is we're trying to solve for first. And so by doing this, it makes it much easier and much more focused to create your actions. So I want to just touch on team action planning, which is kind of a separate initiative where you really want to train your managers on how to kind of have good discussions at the team level. It's going to be the same process I just described. But we really want the team to get involved and take some ownership and, basically voice their opinions. A lot of times the survey questions, they might not address the topic that's most important for the team. And so you use the survey questions to get at that topic. And again, we say 2 meetings. One is to really explore the data, determine what the main problem is we're trying to solve. The second meeting is to really action plan and create some things to focus on to solve it. And then at the end, what you end up with is a nice clean action plan that looks like this. It's hard. It's harder than this. If we want to create employee voice, here are some things we can do about it. And so there's several resources and things you can provide managers to do this, but this is the hard part, getting them to have these discussions. We usually say pick one thing and you'll get some traction going forward. It's been reiterated here by Dawn as well. What Christian said, communicate, you just got to get credit for some of these things that you've done so people recognize that we're listening and responding to the feedback. We don't have time to really talk about the online action planning tool here. We call it Portal, but you can use online action planning tools. Some organizations, you already have those in place through your performance management system or whatever. We have one as well. These help facilitate that and track it so you can kind of see it at the organization level. It's another help, to action planning in the organization. All right, back to where we started. Anything here, Christian, that I missed that you want to include?
No, just that all of these instruments have a place to play, and we usually start building at the anchor survey and filling in the gaps. You can start anywhere on this list. If you're not doing exit surveys, that's a great place to start. That feedback is leaving your organization, and it's very time sensitive. It's once it's gone, it's nearly impossible to get back. So exit surveys is a great place to start. If you're not doing that, anchor surveys, all of these have a place to play in a listening program. So a lot more we could talk about. As Charles mentioned, we do have a certification where we spend a lot more time on this. I think just with the amount of engagement, we'll do another version of this webinar again very soon as well. I appreciate the questions as those have come in as well.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, and thanks everyone for attending and all your comments and participation here. It's been very helpful. Again, we're just trying to share some best practices. We hope you have a real successful survey this year. Bye now.